just introduce you in Spanish because we have a large audience in Spanish. I said that you were a professor of international relations and sociology from the Pardee School of Boston University, and I mentioned several of your academic merits and your recent publication of the book Cuban Privilege in 2022 by Cambridge University Press. So I want to add something that I didn't say in Spanish, but I think that it will be good in English, is that when you are studying American immigration policy, something that I think is important to take into account is that you have a very strong academic interest, but it comes also from the story of your family, in which both of your parents were political refugees, were refugees. So I don't know if you want to add something more to what I said in my presentation of your work and you.
That's fine.
That's fine. So let's go then to work and present the book to the audience of our program here. First, Susan, I would like to know what was your main motivation to study Cuba, Cuban migration, and U.S. policy towards Cuban immigrants?
So my reason for writing the book was I had done research and writing on Cuba for a number of years, and also on Cuban immigrants. So it struck me, well, wouldn't it be interesting to look at the policies that led to the changes in Cuba and to Cuban immigrants in that context? So it's really, I almost think of it as a trilogy, going backwards to first looking at what were the US policies that led Cubans to change. Of course, in the book, I discuss it in detail under successive presidential administrations. So I began with Eisenhower, and my chapters in my book go through the current period under President Biden.
And on this issue, how many times have you been in Cuba? How many times have you teach courses, have taught courses about Cuba?
Well, I've been in Cuba enough times that I can't count. I mean,
yes.
I can count, but I stopped counting, when you went 2-3 times, but at some point I just come and I go, and it's not a big deal in my life. So I honestly can't, tell you the exact number, but numerous times I've gone there. I went there once, I think in 1970s, and then the first time really back, which is when I started doing research and writing on Cuba, was in the midst of the special period, and it was really difficult. I mean, on me, not just on the Cubans, to see, people were so thin. I mean, it wasn't starvation like I imagined would be the case in Rwanda, during the genocide, but you would not wish what I saw on anybody.
Well, let me tell you when was the first time I read about your work.
Uh-huh.
And I remember that around the 1990s, I was able to read the journal Cuban Studies, and you were in a debate with the great Cuban economist Carmelo Mesa Lago, and there was a very well-founded intellectual polemic in which you were discussing with him the continuities and discontinuities between the process of rectifications of errors or mistakes and the process of the policies that were adopted by the Cuban government during the special period. And I found that it was a very well-founded discussion, and from that time, I began to follow your work. And we are talking about probably the early 90s, because I was reading this in my last year at ISRI in Cuba, that should have been around 1993, and it was either 1993 or 94, so it was published probably a year or 2 years before. So I want to be clear on that because I know that I'm talking with a very important expert on Cuba with a large um, CV about working on this issue. Not only your books, you also have done some important articles, field work about Cuba that need to be mentioned here. So tell me about this book, Cuban Privilege, that has arise so much discussion within Miami, including a kind of difficult presentation. I don't want to comment too much on that at Florida International University, but also in other places that I suggest the audience to watch in the Brown Institute, the Watson Institute of International Affairs or World Affairs at Brown University. Tell me about this book. What is the central puzzle? What are the main questions that you decided to research?
Well, the central question really was to understand U.S. Cuban immigration policy, what it was, how it changed over the years, and why, and what were the consequences of those policies, some of which were unintended consequences or policies that did not have the intended effect. So I really became very interested in, I sort of had always, all my research had been on Latin America and Latin Americans. And so for the first time, I was really dissecting U.S. Cuban policy, U.S. foreign policy, which immigration policy turns out was used as an instrument of foreign policy. And I found it very, very interesting. Going over documents, I visited essentially I visited all the presidential libraries that had materials that were relevant to the book.
So did you even go to Abilene in Kansas, to Eisenhower Library?
There was one. I did not go to the Eisenhower Library.
Yeah, but in Boston you deal with a very important Kennedy Presidential Library,
sure,
and Carter, Georgia, etc.
Yes,
so
all of the others up until the second Bush 2 administration, when there's so little material that's available. Most of it has been. It's interesting. They put material in a file and then they pull it, like for 10, 15 years is classified. So the more recent the president, the less information you get.
Okay. Well, let me tell you why I mentioned the library in Abilene, because I am a fan of presidential libraries. And the Eisenhower Library in Abilene is a very interesting place to visit, like many other. Nixon in Yorba Linda, Reagan near San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara.
Reagan, most spectacular.
It's one of the most beautiful, and the view is really gorgeous.
Unbelievable.
The view is really gorgeous. But I say that as Cuban Americans, we should do an effort to visit the places of history in the United States. And we have in our audience some people that are truck drivers. And a couple of them has written to me that they have enjoyed some of my recommendations to visit presidential libraries from time to time. So it's interesting, the Cuban migration. You can have people that were professors in Cuba and now, for instance, work as a truck driver because it's the necessity, and it's something important to recognize and acknowledge the effort that they do. So in the history you covered of USA immigration policy towards Cuba, which were the central patterns or features that you found in order to propose this idea of a Cuban privilege?
Well, as I document in essentially every chapter, which is on a different presidential administration, Cubans received unique immigration rights that other foreigners did not get. I had no idea of that. Okay, it was like one of the things that makes research so interesting when you discover things you knew nothing about. So I entered this project with no preconceptions. The only thing I would say was I knew, let's say, about Elian and the dry foot policy, but that turns out is only part of the extension of benefits to Cubans over the years. And it's interesting because some entitlements were given initially, and then they created new problems. So new entitlements were given. So it's not as if there was a preconceived U.S. Cuban immigration policy. So it really evolved, partly as conditions changed in the U.S., partly as conditions changed in Cuba, and partly as U.S.-Cuban relations changed. So it's in some sense, it's a dynamic story about how Cuban immigration policy changed over the years. But the bottom line is they received unique privileges that no other group received historically. And they continue. So sometimes people will say, well, the Hungarians were given parole and then they were entitled to become lawful permanent residents. That's true. But the laws and the policy that was extended to Hungarians after the uprising there was time specific. What is so unusual, really unusual for our immigration policy, is that the benefits that Cubans obtained, or key benefits that they obtained, continued for decades.
And it doesn't have a sunset. It doesn't have a sunset clause.
Sunset clause, which is highly unusual. I'm not sure if there are any other immigration laws that have that. I was told that there aren't any, but I'm not that a real immigration expert that I could say for every single group that they did not have privileges that were sunset after some period. So, like in the 90s, there was a special adjustment act for Central Americans. And then there was a subsequent one for Haitians, because Haitians had been excluded from the entitlements that the Cubans were getting, even when they came ashore at the same time, and leaving a country.
You said in the book some other cases. It's not that they came on the same times.
Yeah.
They came on the same boat.
Yes.
And it was an Haitian boat that picked up some Cubans in the high seas. They saved their life, and the U.S. welcomed the Cubans and deported the Haitians. Yeah. Am I right on that or not?
Yes, that's definitely.
That's what you begin
story.
The story that you tell us. Let me tell to the audience that when you mention the Hungarian adjustment, you are referring to people who escaped Hungary as part of the rebellion against Soviet interference, Soviet invasion against the Hungarian revolt in 1956. And it's really an important event. And let's remember also, because I think it's something that when people talk about your book, I think sometimes they forget, is that there was the same system that the US repudiated in Cuba in all the Eastern European countries. And an adjustment of this kind was only established toward refugees escaping from a particular event that was the 1956 Hungarian revolt. And I think it's not that there was not a Hungarian Adjustment Act. It was a Hungarian adjustment for people who escaped Hungary in the period after or during the 1956 revolt.
So it was time specific.
I think that's an important element. And we know about just 1 second, because my daughter is here. What happened, Eva? You want to, my daughter, there is a list, Dr. Eckstein, of categories used by the US government. They are referred in your book, in which the executive branch, particularly the president, try or in fact circumvent in some sense the legislation about refugee, and use these categories to provide an opportunity for entrance into the United States to Cubans of different groups. You mentioned that, for instance, there were tourists in the first years of the revolution people who came and entered with tourist visa. Other category was um, entran with an status pending. After Mariel, the Guantanamo entrance during the Clinton administration. Uh, Tell us about what is at the source or at the root of using these categories that make Cubans exceptional in the type of treatment that they receive from the US government.
Right. So to begin with, immigration is actually, in principle, regulated by Congress. And, we've had our current immigration policy stems from a law that was passed in 1965 under President Johnson signed it into law. And it had been worked on. It took years for this law to get, it was amending an earlier Immigration Act, but it's very difficult getting Congress to make laws. And so in the context of that, presidents have used their own discretionary power to extend entitlements, unique entitlements to Cubans. And that started very early under President Eisenhower, who was president at the time Castro came to power. And it's all in the context of the Cold War. So Eisenhower entitles these Cubans to come in and finds ways. And one of the first ways was with tourist visas. And when they were known not to be tourists. Another thing was Cubans could come and they would be accepted with special entry privileges once they got to the United States. Well, any other immigrant would tell you they couldn't probably even enter a plane without having the permission for entry into the country where the plane was going. So these were various presidential...
Well, even Cubans before 1959 were not able to do anything like that.
Right. No, the policy changes with when Castro comes to power. And so, I think presidents partly, I think initially there was this feeling they didn't want a revolution. The U.S. did not want a revolution in America's backyard. And so in bringing the immigrants in, it was really interesting reading the documents, the way in which the U.S. was trying to give them special refugee benefits, even though they officially didn't meet the refugee definition. And one of the reasons was, first, they wanted Cubans to come to show how much opposition there was to the Castro government. And so that was, again, part of the foreign policy. Another thing was when in extending the greatest refugee program America's ever offered foreigners, it was partly to train them to be future leaders in a post-Castro government. And it was really interesting to see that. So, they were really trained and given education, given university free rides in terms of loans and gratis.
Let me add something here. In his memoirs, Ambassador Philip Bonsall, who was the first ambassador after the revolution, he mentioned that it was not necessarily good for Cuban opposition the level of patronage that was adopted by the United States to them. That it was a kind of a position that the US was putting the opposition of telling them, we are going to take care of your problem. And in some sense, it's very interesting that I think that perhaps we can mention those issues that obviously you wrote a particular book. It's not about multiple things, but I found that your book is in line with the historical record because there is even a discussion among US officials about the route that the relation was taking as a result of a policy of which the migration status for the Cubans was only one piece of the puzzle. And I think that this is very interesting what you mentioned there. But there are other status, like the entrant status pending with Carter that happened after the 1965 immigration law. that Immigration Act. By the way, let me say that for those of us who study Latino politics, and I have taught several courses of Latino politics in the United States, the 1965 Immigration Act is considered a major progressive achievement because it broke with the tradition of the quotas and some discriminatory practice against people that were coming from Latin America, and it provides some advantages to people from European background because it was based in a kind of percentage of people that already were living in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So can you talk about this status of Guantanamo entrance by Clinton, entrance status pending after Mariel 1980?
I would say the entrance status pending that President Carter invented really to be able to make Cubans was really, really interesting. In part, it happens 1 month after President Clinton signs the Refugee Act of 1988.
President Carter.
And this is actually the Refugee Act that remains in place today. So he signed that law in March of 1980, and lo and behold, a month later, are Cubans coming ashore. And he says they do not meet the definition of a refugee that is embedded in the Refugee Act of the United States. So he, I think, morally felt he could not admit them as refugees. It's negating a law.
It was the official position of the U.S. government.
Yes, exactly.
They said they don't qualify under the international definition and under the U.S. Refugee Act, and therefore we are going to use this ad hoc status to solve the situation.
Exactly, and to let them in, because actually initially he tried to keep them from coming to the United States, and he just was not, the political opposition to that stance was just too great. So in that context, his administration invented a new category, I think, that had never been used in immigration before, that of entrance status pending, which meant that the long-term status of those people was not defined
at the moment when they entered to the United States.
Right.
Not even the path to legal residency was defined when they entered to the United States. Well, let me tell the audience that we are talking about the book Cuban Privilege, and we are talking with Susan Eckstein. Susan Eva Eckstein. I love her middle name a lot because it's also the name of Eva that interrupted us when we were doing the interview. And many of these things that we are talking here are very well explained in her book. So I suggest that those of you who can read it, go and read it. The book is in Kindle. It's not a cheap book, but you can go there and buy it, or you can have a hard copy version in Amazon.com, etc. So, Susan, if we go to, let me ask you another question that in some sense you had already advanced an answer. How did the context of the Cold War shape U.S. migration relations with Cuba? Because it is very important to explain why did the Cubans get this privileged status?
Right, and it's an extremely good question, because Cubans did not always get those special privileges. It was only in the when Castro comes to power 90 miles offshore from the United States, when the U.S. felt that the Western Hemisphere was its sphere of influence. And so that is really the origins of why this series of entitlements were extended to Cubans, because it became an instrument of U.S. Cold War policy. What's interesting is that those entitlements continued in the post-Cold War. So after the original reason no longer existed. And then what's so interesting is that the reason that Cubans continue to get unique privileges that other immigrants didn't get, is because in the very process of extending entitlements to Cubans, they used them very well, right? They became American citizens. They could vote. They could lobby. They could elect their own people to Congress, etc. And they became wealthy. And in those ways, they were really able to, in turn, influence U.S.-Cuban policy. So the policies continued. It became such also, one cannot forget that they're mainly settling in Florida, which is the largest, was maybe the largest swing state, and became increasingly important since the number of electoral college votes that went to Florida increased from 10 in 1960, when very few Cubans had gotten here, to now it's up to 29. So it's tripled. And it's the fourth largest state in terms of electoral college votes. So no president wants to discount the Florida vote. And that is another reason why they have been so responsive to the wants of Cuban American politicians, etc.
And it's not only the numbers of seats in the Electoral College, but also the swing state character that Florida acquired by in virtue of demographic trends that make Florida less a typical southern state and more a swing state in the dynamic post-civil rights history in the United States. Let me say a couple of things there. The first one is, I think that your emphasis in the Cold War is very well explained in the book. I, however, will say that there is certain inertia and the way the narrative, and it will be an interesting idea to move from a constructivist point of view, is that the narrative that was built around Cuba was that Cuba was a particularly totalitarian and nasty situation in comparison not only with other countries in the region, but even with countries like the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union. The privilege that the Cubans received was based on the idea that Cuba was probably a concentration camp. We have frequent references to a kind of Nazi Germany in the Caribbean that received a privileged status that not even refugees from the real Nazi Germany received in the United States. And I think that it is very difficult. In some sense, the US was trapped in a contradiction. I think that good analysts that were studying Cuba knew that this was not a real good analysis. Cuba had totalitarian characteristics as an outcome of the revolution. Eventually, Lins and Stepan will qualify Cuba as a post-totalitarian state, but it was nothing like a Pol Pot in the Caribbean or a North Korea, but that was the type of narrative that particularly after Reagan became dominant in the treatment about Cuba and the emphasis on the issue of human rights as a baseball bat to hit the Cuban government in the head. And when you have this type of narrative, it's very difficult to go to an immigration court or apply a policy that say that those who escape what you call a concentration camp in which everybody there, not that you have some people that are persecuted there, but that everybody there is living under the fear of persecution, then when those people jump the fence of your construction of a concentration camp, it's very difficult to say we are going to apply normal policies. So I would say that even within the Cold War, the treatment of Cuba was exceptional in the way Cuba was treated. And you see, for instance, that the Reagan administration speak like improvement in the situation in South Africa or improvement in the situation of Poland after 1981. But the Reagan administration is very reluctant to recognize any improvement in Cuba in human rights status, or even the Bush administration when the Cubans pulled their troops out of Angola or something like that. And I think this is an important element. And second, let me tell something, and I will make one reference to the discussion that happened in FIU. And the person who argued against your explanation, he mentioned the Cold War, but he said, I'm going to quote his word. He said that there is a shadow of guilt. He used this word, a shadow of guilt that the American government felt for betraying Cuba's freedom fighter, meaning the armed opposition that hosted and supported by the United States invade Cuba in Bay of Pigs, or the agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, in which the United States commit itself not to invade Cuba. I find that it's interesting every idea or hypothesis that anybody can come. But first of all, I don't think that the United States had any commitment whatsoever to support some people that want to overthrow the government of another country. And I don't find in documents this feeling of guilt. When I read the Frus collection, Foreign Relation of the United States Act, it's very difficult to find that there was such a thing as a shame or guilt for abandoning those Cubans and not subordinating all the national interests of the United States, even going to a nuclear war, because the most important thing was to be in solidarity with these anti-communist fighters. I don't find this, at least in the documents. I just want to mention that, and if you want to make a comment, feel free.
No, I think that's very interesting. The other point I really would like to make is I'm discussing U.S.-Cuban policy from 59 until the present. And, you know, recent presidents do not have any, if there ever was guilt on the part of Kennedy, there's no basis for guilt on recent presidents. And yet, you know, Cubans have continued to get special entitlements.
Exactly. I found this, and if there is a shadow of guilt, I think that there are other areas in which U.S. government probably will have to exercise this type of good conscience exercise or debate. So one appropriate case for comparison that you use is the policy towards Haitians that we mentioned before. Which were your main findings about this issue? Because we are talking about a country that fit better not on the idea of Nazi Germany. I always remember the phrase that Hitler is a good metaphor only for Hitler, not for any other dictator. It's my view. But if there was a country that in some sense fit even the phrase that Biden used about Cuba today, or in other administration, failed state, a sultanistic dictatorship, a family in power that persecute everybody else, that is not a totalitarian. In this case, it will be a sultanistic regime, is Haiti. However, it's interesting the comparisons that you established between the treatment of Haitians and the treatment of Cubans. Which were your main findings in this respect?
Well, my main findings were that systematically Haitians were not given the entitlements that Cubans have. The Haitians have been deported. Haitians have been blocked from even getting into the country. You know, at the same time as the Coast Guard would pick Cubans up in the Straits of Florida and bringing them to the United States, so that they were able to then be paroled and then become lawful permanent residents and citizens. The Haitians were not given those entitlements. So the Haitians who did come without authorization, such as the Cubans, they had one real shot. Well, they had maybe two shots at becoming lawful permanent residents. So one was in 1980 under President Carter. there was pressure from from Haitian rights advocates that the Haitians who were coming abroad at the same time as Cubans, in the same sea, etc., that they should be treated the same. And so Haitians were given almost all the same entitlements that Cubans were given under Carter, but neither of them became lawful permanent residents. Cubans under President Reagan were declared refugees, just declared. There was no evidence that anybody had to show they'd been living here 20 years or so, right? But Reagan just said they're refugees, well, and including the Mariels, who were recent. And so on that basis, the Cubans got on a path to lawful permanent residency and citizenship, and the Haitians were left in midstream. They were not given the same rights. So it was only in 1986 with the IRCA, the Immigration Act, that Haitians, along with other unauthorized immigrants who met certain conditions, were able to get on a path to lawful permanent residence. And then the second time was in 1996-97, when the Haitian Adjustment Act was passed, when NACRA to Nicaragua Cubans did not extend them to Haitians, and that led to a lot of uproar of just blatant discrimination. So then a Haitian Act was passed, and it was only during a narrow period of a couple of years that sorry, I got distracted. It was only for a 2-year period, so there was a time-specific period for the Haitians.
Exactly.
An open-ended period for the Cubans.
Exactly, and even in the 90s, there was a period that there were Cubans who were trying to come here as part of the rafter crisis, and people from Haiti that just has been there as a result of the coup d'etat against President Aristide, and both of them were placed in Guantanamo, but not the Haitians didn't receive the category of Guantanamo entrance.
Right.
And I found that this is really well explained in your book. Please remind me, there is a chapter, I think it's chapter 7 on your book, that is basically where the whole book, let me tell the audience, the whole book, from time to time, you can find comparisons between Haiti and Cuba. But in this case, it's a whole chapter that if you want to read something fast, go there and read that. Well, Susan, I wanted to ask you about the Obama. You give us 1 hour, but I'm going to leave with one final question. And I would like that you mention the situation in the Obama administration that is basically an important watershed that imply some adjustment significantly about the medical professional parole program that the president ended, and in the case of the dry food, wet food policy. I want to ask you, what do you think about this change of the policy and how President Trump adapted to this new reality that he received by January 20, 2016, when he became president?
Right. So Obama changed Cuban immigration policy his last full week in office. So, Trump really, that's what Trump inherited. And Trump, really continued much of what Obama did, because he was really anti-immigrant and anti-refugee. So,
except that he went back to the diagnostic about Cuba as a concentration camp. Right. So I think only Trump can do something like that. Say that a place is a concentration camp, and those who are escapees from the concentration camp, you say, no, I'm not going to open the doors of America. He's a New Yorker, but I think that he didn't read well the Emma Lazarus poem in the Statue of Liberty. But he's able to say two things that, in my view, no other American president in recent years will be able to say. a concentration camp, but if you escape from there, I don't want you here. But continue, please.
So yeah, no. So I mean, I think Obama changed the policies. First, there was a widespread agreement and resentment from other immigrants that Cubans had this special entitlement. You know, they'd be at the border, and more Latin Americans, people from around the world, were going to the U.S. border to come in, and the Cubans just walked in while the others were being turned away. And so I think resentment was really building up among other immigrants towards the special treatment that Cubans were given. And the other thing that was really interesting is that some of the Cuban American leaders in Congress started critiquing the special entitlements that Cubans were getting, such as all Cubans, according to the welfare reform of 1996, as modified in 1997, the Cubans are the only nationality that is entitled to welfare automatically upon reaching the United States. Other legal immigrants have to wait 5 years. Unauthorized immigrants never qualify for welfare, except if they're Cuban. So, you know, these are just resentments that were that were built up, and so I think the Cuban American members of Congress started.
Excuse me, Susan. Can you keep the camera there, because sometimes you put yourself.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. That's much better.
So what happened was that members of Congress, Cuban American members of Congress, started pushing for a change in U.S.-Cuban policy to be much more restrictive in who would qualify for refugee status. And they claimed that if a person made a homeland trip to see, you know, a dying parents or to see whatever, they would not be considered refugees, and therefore not entitled to refugee benefits and refugee status.
I think this is very interesting. I don't know if I read this part well in your book, but it's a very interesting topic that you raise here, and it is the issue of Cuban right-wing opposition to the continuation of the privilege. And this is fascinating.
Fascinated me when I read it. It's in my chapter on Obama.
But it happened. I'm gonna go back and read it, and it is very important because, in some sense, they are part of the claim against what they consider an abuse of the privilege.
Yeah.
And in some sense here, it has to do with the changing context. That when Obama changed his policy, the mood in the community was of people that were very interested in a circular type of migration. That they will come, they will receive. The Cuban government changed its migration laws, and they allow people to stay outside the country up to 2 years. Therefore, they can stay in America, qualify as resident, and then go back to Cuba. And I'm telling you very clearly, I think this is not a problem, at least for me, because if you adjust your status, it doesn't mean that you are going to forget your family, or that once you are a resident or a citizen, you will not go back, because you didn't enter as a refugee. You participate in a process, or one participates in a process, and after 1 year, you can claim a different status, adjust your status. Well, Susan, what a great privilege. Really, this is a privilege, a Cuban privilege, to have you here in our program, and have the opportunity to discuss these issues with some level of sobriety, and discuss the main thesis of your book. And I hope and I recommend to all our audience, the people that listen to this program, that they go and read the book. The title is Cuban Privilege, and the author is our guest today, Susan Eva Eckstein. So, Susan, anything else that you want to say to our audience?
No, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I thought you asked really interesting questions.
Thank you very much. So,
The privilege was mine.
oh, it's mutual. So I hope that people can read the book, and it will be a great. This is a good place for people that want to put comments in the chat or interact with us. And we are open always to this type of conversation. So let's say goodbye,
Thank you.
and until the next time. Hasta la vista. Bueno, sí, dígame.
Okay, bye now.
Bye bye. Bueno, señores, ha sido Susan Eckstein que ha estado con nosotros aquí y ha sido un placer. Recuerden estar en contacto. La entrevista tuvo que ser en inglés por la conveniencia de la comunicación. Ella me pidió que lo hiciéramos así. Yo sé que eso nos quita un poco de audiencia, pero se gana mucho en la comprensión de lo que ella podía decir. Y ustedes saben que esto ha sido objeto, el libro ha sido objeto de importantes ataques e incluso ataques personales. Yo en español solo quería recordar una cosa que yo viendo el video me pareció verdadero, lamentable y fuera de hechos. En el medio del debate en FIU, cuando ella dijo que ella era era hija de padres que eran refugiados y que también un estudiante se asomó y dijo que dijo que él era de origen judío, y dijo que él había visto con dolor cómo en Miami se hablaba de que la situación cubana era peor que la de la Alemania hitleriana. Fíjense qué contexto, y que había habido el holocausto cubano mayor que el holocausto judío. Hubo personas que le gritaron: háblame de los privilegios, del privilegio judío, de los refugiados judíos. Déjenme decir solo esto, señores, no, sin quitarle mérito a nadie, sin dejar de reconocer que en la revolución se produjeron abusos y que hay cosas así. Por favor, repito lo que le dije a Susan. Hitler es una metáfora solo para usar con Hitler. Nunca hubo en Cuba un holocausto cubano. Pero además, si para acudir a atacar a las personas que hacen trabajo histórico serio, usted tiene que inventar que hubo un privilegio judío de migración, yo creo que es lamentable, porque si algo pasó en la historia es que, y además es un bochorno reconocido por la gran mayoría de líderes de la nación e historiadores que han estudiado la política migratoria, es que fue que en medio de un real holocausto, donde las personas por su origen no podían ni siquiera mentir y decir que ellos aceptaban el gobierno nazi. O sea, no era ni siquiera por una opinión, era por algo que no se podía cambiar. Fueron tomados, detenidos, esas personas en virtud de quién era uno de sus bisabuelos, y fueron enviados a los campos de concentración. Sí, yo creo que no le hace beneficio alguno a un debate sobrio, apropiado, basado en el récord histórico, basado en el interés en construir una vida mejor, superando los problemas históricos que puedan haber ocurrido, estar inventando ni la mentira del privilegio judío en inmigración. Entonces, en este caso, estos son discusiones en las cuales uno gana cuando empieza por lo más elemental, que es los hechos. Independientemente de lo que usted haya sufrido en Cuba, esas dos cosas que le dijeron al que estaba haciendo la pregunta y gritaron a Susan Eckstein, simple y llanamente no están en línea con las invocaciones a José Martí y a la idea de vivir en la verdad. Entonces, señores, ha sido un gusto estar con ustedes, ha sido un gusto estar con Susan Eckstein, Susan Eva Eckstein aquí, y nos vemos en la próxima aventura. Hasta la próxima.